This third session is about bringing together some threads, asking some questions that remain unanswered, answer new questions, trying to develop some ideas. We'll start with me trying to summarize some things. I thought I will do it through lunchtime, but I didn't do it, so I'm going to improvise. So, the first session, we had a real discussion about how to reconstruct the discipline, whether by expanding the canon or rethinking it differently. And that came back in the second session with Paget's idea of bringing the four lenses together. And there is here really a debate about the canon and the discussion of the boundaries, but I don't know, perhaps because I'm a big believer, in the popular front idea. I think that there are a lot of things in common that were said. We all agree in the need of bringing Du Bois and the perspective of racial capitalism. We all agree that Du Bois is not enough. Du Bois is just one of many. We all agree about the need of an intersectional perspective that incorporates gender perspectives. And although, if I recall correctly, Paget was the only one to mention it, but I think that there will be much disagreement in thinking about the question of environment as central of any decolonial reconstruction of sociology. So I think that there is a lot of points in common that we can agree, and discussions that can be, serious discussions. But I said when I asked Michael about the canon that in a sense we are all in the same way, because we're all in the group that thinks that sociology needs to be reformed, in the group that values theory and that values the theoretical engagement with empirical material that sociology does. And I had this conversation with where is Jordana about the boundaries of the discipline, where she insists that she's interdisciplinary, and I insist that what she does is sociology, or at least what she does is how I envision sociology. And I think that that's one of the things that, one of the goals of this conversation that has many goals and many dimensions, because one of the goals is really to expand the boundaries of sociology to make more things legitimate. So, we heard from Katrina how she thinks as an outsider in the discipline, and what she does is sociology. I think that we lost people, and we lost valuable people, and we lost valuable ideas and valuable research with that. So one of the goals of doing this is so people like Katrina will not feel like have to ask themselves that question. And their committees, and we have seen that a lot, won't ask them that question. And Jordana can stay interdisciplinary if she wants, but she could have a home to come back if she wants. So part of it is, what it was saying, decolonizing American sociology. And I think it's important because it's making it open, more open, more critical, more inclusive. And, sometimes we think, we feel guilty that we are in the elite, and we feel guilty that we are here. But we are here, and this is what we can do, and we have certainly an influence on that. And there's no, there's no reason to not do these things and not, making what we can change small around us change it. And I think so. One of the impulses is that, and I think that we have this discussion about how to reconstruct the canon or not, but there is a lot to come together around, and a lot to think about, making sociology really a place where people doing critical decolonial work won't have to ask themselves, is this sociology? So that's one thing. And it is important too, because we say, why are not here people from the periphery? Well, Paget, as and Sophia, I go back and forth. So it's not completely true. I mean, it's a question of budget. Basically, if I had budget to make a 3-day conference with a lot of people from the periphery, I would do it. But Nitzan was generous enough to share her budget, but her budget is small. So we do what we can. But I mean, it is important also because, like it or not, and we mostly don't like it, but it is the case, that what we do here reverberates somewhere else. I mean, when we talk about the structures of coloniality that puts us at the center, makes what is discussed at the center relevant for what is discussed at other places. Because then we get to the discussion of what happens in the sociologies, in the peripheries, and there are different trends, and we look at different places, we see different things. The thing that I know is Latin American sociology, and it used to be a homegrown theorization around dependency theory that had its problems, but it was thinking from the periphery, and that kind of got lost and was replaced by a kind of bringing of the US model that had good things, because the US model, with all its emphasis on empirical research and methods, let's do more training and more capacity in empirical research and methods, but also less homegrown thinking about critical theory. So in a sense, the model of coloniality is that models are copied. So if we create an alternative model here, it has an effect somewhere else. But it is true that, as Sophia said, and as Katrina said, and as Paget, I mean, we need to look for conversations and cooperations beyond our borders. But as it was very clear in the panel, it's not every conversation and not every network, precisely because the question of coloniality, in the same way that the colonizing syllabus is not bringing people from the periphery because any person from the periphery, because any person from the periphery can, we have enough reactionary, ultranationalist, exclusionary, racist people in the periphery. So it's not just automatically thinking that everything that is done in the periphery is right. It's looking for the connections that, in a sense, bring forward a really decolonial and critical thing. And that, I think, is something that Paget said. We need to recuperate the tradition of, and Sophia said, anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism. It's the decolonial project is not just about, citing people from the periphery or just connecting with anybody or anything, but it's a project of critical of racial and colonial capitalism and thinking beyond racial and colonial capitalism. So those are the connections, and we really need to look for them. In a sense, the Decolonial Project is a project of public sociology, it's a project of theoretical sociology, but it's also a project of public sociology, of which Du Bois is a model, and also Michael has been, for the last decade or 2 decades, emphasizing that and trying to move American sociology from its provincial cocoon to expand the dialogue of sociology. So I think that all these themes comes, and we need to be clear about this. As Sophia said, it's not just about the cultural and the symbolic. It's also about the material and about the connections. But it's not any connection, as she was saying, as Cabral and as Fanon, as Du Bois himself, because Du Bois himself also warned us about what happens if it is the local bourgeoisie that directs the National Liberation Project. It ends up in creating basically other forms of inequality. So all these themes of expanding the boundaries of the discipline came up, and I think are important, and beyond the difference, I think there is a lot of commonalities. The thing about this being an emancipatory and a public sociology project are important, and understanding that it's not just about any connection with the periphery, but creating connections that are critical and emancipatory. So if I had to resume looking, at the question that I posed at the beginning, what does it mean to decolonize the discipline? I mean, this was a very rich discussion that I cannot summarize in a few minutes, but if I look for some elements that emerge as a program of action and as a program of, how we go about decolonizing sociology, I would emphasize those elements. And I think that beyond the discussions that are real that emerge here and beyond the different things, there is those elements of commonality that we can really, I think, all embrace and all work towards. But that would be my summary of, I was talking earlier, people were asking me, well, are you happy with how the event went? And I was saying, it went beyond all my expectations in terms of public, in terms of participation, in terms of the quality of the discussion. So, but I would emphasize that. I think it leaves us with something to work with, but mostly, this is an opportunity for people who have been here all morning to bring their own ideas, for the panel to expand on ideas that you wanted to expand. But I would say, as a program of what is to be done, like, we all agree on expanding the canon on some ways that that were brought up here. We didn't talk. Katrina asked about asking different questions, and I think it's important. What questions we ask, and we didn't talk about methods, and I think it's important. And it's about, yes, it is about decolonizing American sociology, but that's important because American sociology, because of the structure of coloniality, matters, and it's about creating networks and contacts and alliances with people around the world in the periphery, and not only in the periphery, but people who embrace this kind of decolonial, critical, emancipatory politics. It's not just anybody beyond the boundaries of the United States. So, I throw you a program of action. I don't know if you agree, disagree, want to add things, or want to address other things that were not mentioned. So now the floor is open to the participants if they want to say something more, and to the audience if you stayed with questions. So yes, Nicole.
I just want to ask a question of the group. When I first came here to Brown, I didn't know if I was a decolonial scholar. I certainly wasn't like pro-colonial, but I never thought I certainly thought of myself as a critical race scholar, but didn't feel like I had access to this, like the movement of decolonial scholarship. And so I honestly felt like I used to rely on Prob, I relied on Jose to learn and just continue learning. And I'd love to hear too, why are the critical race threads so separate from the decolonial scholarship, and how can we fuse these movements so that there is a sense of welcomeness to both, even if you're not quote unquote well versed in one side or the other. And I don't even understand why they're siloed, so I'd be curious to hear. It's a question.
Well, I can answer that, but if anybody else, I don't want to monopolize the talking here. So, Saida.
I draw on, so I'm not very well versed in critical race theory, but I do draw on Bonilla Silva's work, for example, quite a bit for my work. The limitation that I see in Bonilla Silva's work, or maybe other folks too, of critical race theory, is there's no talk of empire and coloniality. So for somebody who works on a non-US situation, yes, all of these ideas like racialization as culture makes complete sense in my part of the world too, but without that question of coloniality, I can't see the connection.
Katrina?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot as someone who thinks of myself as a race scholar, but isn't necessarily always read as one. And so when I was on the job market, people said, oh, you're a political sociologist. And I thought that was interesting, because I am, sure, but I also primarily have seen myself as a race scholar. And I think it's, for me, at least within American sociology, it's an artifact of thinking that white supremacy is I don't think this is true of everyone, but I think that there's a tradition in the discipline of thinking of white supremacy as primarily or only manifest in the black-white color line. And so when we think about the black-white color line within the boundaries of the United States and don't even think about it in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, then we don't see, there's a way of not seeing colonialism, right, of just seeing the manifestations of white supremacy and racism in the continent. And I think that, you know, the work in the 2000s by Patricia Collins and Evelyn Mercado-Glenn sort of allow us to think about different types of relationality and different constructions of white supremacy in different regions. So that's up from the race end. From the empire end, I've been puzzled by scholars of empire who don't necessarily see themselves as doing work on race, when their work is about hierarchy, differentiation, us-them boundaries. And I think it comes also, again, from a narrow way of thinking about what race is. That's primarily, I think, shaped by the history of the development of US sociology of race as the study of these strange black men on a street corner by white sociologists or something like that, right? And so seeing race in other ways in terms of the operation of power, I think has often been limited in ways that keep empire, migration, and race scholars separate. At least that's my take.
Well, I see a lot of, well, I mean, you know, Jordana, Nabila, Paget, and Nicholas.
So, you know, for me, you know, when you, and I think that one of the things that has come up today is that we all have different ideas of what these terms mean, right? For me, when I've talked in the past about what it means to decolonize as a program for action, it's a modality of changing, but I think the way we've talked about it here is more like a tradition. But for me, I don't actually separate critical race theory from decolonial studies. I actually don't at all, and I don't think it makes much sense. And certainly what Katrina, you know, you're saying about of being a race scholar and being a scholar of empire and these kinds of like, you know, ideational like divides is true, but when I teach it, I don't actually, like, I teach race in the world political economy, and I teach, you know, Mike Davis's late Victorian Holocaust, and I teach about, you know, India and China and like the Opium Wars and about, you know, colonialism, and that to me is racial capitalism. That's not, you know, it's not just the transatlantic slave trade, it's empire. And so I think that there's a way that, you know, scholars might situate themselves, but then there's an active translation that comes when we write and when we teach that can actually build bridges across by identifying the parallels and identifying the similar lineages of, so for me it's not a finished thing, it's how you assert, and when you assert, you create new traditions and new schools of thought.
Yeah, I would just like to echo, you know, what Jordana just said, that you can trace the origins of decolonial theory very specifically. And I'm happy to say it has roots here at Brown. Nelson Maldonado Torres, happy to say a student of mine, is one of the big people in decolonial theory. And what separate, I mean, I kept using the term decolonization and the evolution of the term decolonial and then decoloniality. What separated me and Nelson was Nelson's turn to Foucault, his turn to the epistemic conditions, right, that of knowledge production in both a colonial and an anti-colonial setting. So he would say to me, oh, Paget, when you focus on imperialism, you focus on race, and you focus on class, I'm focusing on knowledge production. I want to bring into this conversation what it means to produce knowledge under colonial conditions. You take that for granted. And he was absolutely right, you know? And so we had this debate. You know, today he's one of the leading theorists of decolonial, one of the proponents of decolonial theory. So, we can then get into Walter Mignolo, his connections with all of these people, and they have put this particular discourse on the map. Critical race theory, right, of course, has a different genealogy, right? Begins very much in law departments, law schools and that sort of stuff. I think there's no need for us to erase these different genealogies, but certainly in the moment, we can bring them together. So it's not an either or. I think the people who created these discourses deserve to be recognized for them. I can tell you Nelson worked very hard on this because he had me to fight. I kept saying, decolonization, we'll do it. You know, let's just stay with that. And so, you know, he pushed and pushed and pushed, and here it is. So I think they need to be recognized for that. But at the same time, I certainly think you can bring decolonial theory together with critical race theory. They are covering basically the same territory, right?
So I want to say that there's definitely room for convergence, but in terms of, you know, like going back to kind of, does critical race theory, does it kind of admit that, you know, something that, you know, scholars of settler colonialism will say over and over to you, which is that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. In what way is it manifest as an event? What way does it manifest as a structure? Like, to me, a lot of the kind of bifurcation of critical race theory from the, you know, the structure of colonialism does that. It sort of, a lot of it just kind of seems like, you know, this is happening right now, it's been happening for a while, but like, in what ways are there continuities and discontinuities between the structures of racial capitalism and what critical race theory studies at the level of institutions? And I think, you know, in converging those two, you get really great stuff, like critical race, just like decolonization theory is great at episteme, but, you know, you might need to say more about how prisons are like schools and schools are like prisons, and like you might need to do more like institutional like work into like the mechanisms of institutions that critical race theory can really build. But at the same time, critical race theory also has to acknowledge that colonialism is a structure and not event at the moment that it is studying the phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm a theorist, not a sociologist. Over here around fourth year, so I have a different kind of take. When I'm trying to kind of map my critical race theory, I put it in like Afro-British, I put it in Afro-Caribbean, and I put it in like Afro-American, right? And then I put the Afro-American kind of in the slot that Henry was talking about with the more liberal institutional wing. I put the Afro-British in more of the Marxist class thing about Stuart Hall, and I put the Afro-Caribbean in kind of the Afro-nationalist stuff that you would see in Garvey, right? You see all these things play out in theoretical arguments in America and in these departments. I think the problem is how I see it, coming from Birmingham, Alabama, you know, low class. I got in here off of basically tricks and whims, right? If you decolonize a space, but the people that you bring in here are still part of the kind of the wing and mechanism. I think the speaker earlier was talking about that, the kind of hopping off of that. Even when as a professor, if I'm working with certain professors, I'm working with Foucault, I'm working with Fanon, I'm working with Rawls to kind of do some stuff. There's nobody to work with, right? So even when you try to establish these new relationships with somebody you bring in here, it becomes this in and out relationship of, okay, now there's the foreigner. Kind of like I think Derrida talked about the friend and the enemy, kind of, the Aristotle stuff. Now I'm kind of seen. I'm doing work on recognition, and now it becomes that I actually become this new type of Negro, this new type of thing being created in Brown. There's no way to stop it. I couldn't come to Patrick, I couldn't come to anybody. So that's when I think about how institutional racism can start to become this kind of structure, right? Where you can kind of actually see the moving parts moving forward. And to me, and this decolonizing the curriculum, not saying it doesn't do anything for me, but it's more of a conservative move, kind of like taking down statues, and it almost like obfuscates the responsibility. I'm a liberal. Obfuscates the duties and obligations that the institution should have, not as the individual wing, but as an overall structure. So that's my little take on that.
So what I'm thinking about is, can a sociology that is disconnected from community engagement be decolonial by kind of construct? And who is our knowledge production for when we're bound by job markets and bound by tenure committees and bound by a heavily structured, here's the book I need to publish and here's this article, and who is our research design serving when we know we change what we want to do to fit all the cookie cutters of that, whether that journal committee or that people, I don't know, whoever we're sending that book contract to. And then my other question is, I know Prab invites us to epistemologically decenter the university when we're thinking about authentic community engagement. So like kind of what Professor Edwards was inviting us to do, and to even think about who do we even partner with in the periphery, quote unquote, or the peripherized places, and what does material, whether reparations or thinking through material engagement look like. We are sitting on a lot of wealth in terms of our institutions, and many institutions in the US can actually mandate, at the very least, translating our knowledge products to the peripheralized communities that we engage with, and translating the to like whether public sociology or any other ways to actually even have these conversations with our interlocutors and send back a knowledge that we think they ought to actually learn more about than us being here making opinions about Afghanistan or Lebanon or Haiti or any other country that we're making all these, like, we extract the knowledge, we come here, we benefit, and we're all sitting in that privilege. But what does it mean to extract that knowledge and for us to get these awards when we're not sending any of that back?
Well, those are hard questions.
So I mean, I'll start by saying I'm not a sociologist. I took 2 classes at Berkeley, one in sociology and decolonization, and I'm half through the class with Jose here. So if they would have checked my credentials in the door, I probably would have been kicked out. But I sense from the discussion that sociology it's extremely theoretical. It's kind of divorced from real life. So, I looked at critical theory, from the news, and it's just one theory. It's massively disagreed with, it's weaponized, and it's politicized. So if the colonies haven't really decolonized in their studies, having learned this negative environment they lived under, what is it really going to take for sociology to be decolonized? And I even sense, all the speakers didn't quite agree on how to do it. So how is this massive amount of decentralized system, it's truly going to be decolonized in the terms of this study?
Trying to respond. I mean, there's things beyond decolonization. Decolonization tries to remedy some bias and problems, analytical problems, from the past of the discipline, right? So we can ask rather that we recognize that sociological analysis has historically has been skewed and biased. And we can also think about it in terms of simply being methodologically and analytically more accurate and taking into consideration historical relations and social relations that previously have been, for political or other reasons, left outside of the analytical scope, and now we would like to bring them back. But that's not easy, because the whole discipline itself, for such a long time, has been complicit with it. That's my answer. Like, it's not necessarily all about decolonizing as a political movement of the day, but of doing more accurate, analytically, methodologically accurate sociology.
Just a couple of points. I mean, to answer briefly, Nicole's question, in a sense, again, with the idea of the popular front, critical race theory and decolonial sociology are different, but they, in a sense, look in the same direction. So there is no need for them to be, you know, opposing theories. I mean, that's the logic of, you know, if you want to publish an article in, you know, AJSR, you say, yeah, I'm this theory and I oppose that theory. But, I mean, and if you want to do a mainstream career in sociology, you know, that's how you do it. But if you really want to change how sociology works, then you recognize these differences, but you engage in dialogue, in conversation. And you know, as it was said, the main point is, you know, the coloniality looks globally and looks at colonialism and looks beyond the black-white divide. I mean, and you know, my own construction of the coloniality is rooted more in Du Bois than in the Mignolo Foucault kind of version, and because Du Bois had this beautiful thing that brings together political economy and the analysis of culture and subjectivity, so give us a model. But I think that, you know, in a sense, we need to address Georgina's challenge, which is, you know, if we really want to be decolonial, and I don't, you know, I'm a theorist too, so, you know, I work on theory, and I think that ideas matter, and because ideas construct, you know, how we approach things and how we understand, but you know, if we stay just there in the world of theoretical discussion and do not think, you know, how our discipline, you know, can translate into dialogue with the indigenous communities that Katrina was talking about, with local communities in Providence and with people around the world, and then we are staying a step too short of what the colonial sociology ought to be. And, you know, again, back to Du Bois, he was a consummate public sociologist, and back to Michael, he has been, you know, in the trenches for decades, trying to make that case and trying to make sociology talk, American sociology to talk beyond the boundaries of sociology at the International Sociological Association. And so, you know, we have a history and we have past models and current models to start thinking and to start, you know, thinking how we go beyond the individual career and get the award and get, you know, and I'm not against people who do that. That's fine, you know, for people who want that to be their life. But if you want to be in the decolonial vote, you cannot be limited to that. I mean, you know, it doesn't make sense. So, you know, probably none of us can fully answer Georgina's work. I mean, maybe Michael, if you want to talk about the work that you have done for many, many years on this question of public sociology and how to correct, but it is a challenge for us. I mean, we cannot just stay. I mean, PJ was saying, well, we are too theoretical. Well, I mean, theory matters, but you know, we cannot stay there. You want to?
I'm just kind of thinking about a lot of things people have been saying have been probing me to think about what kind of models for something like this exist outside of the university or are already happening. I've been most involved in prison-related reform efforts, so it kind of brings me to the fact that I noticed this very conversation, these same threads of ideas are going on in the world of criminal justice policy reform as a space that has largely been led by people who aren't directly impacted by the justice system themselves, but there's a real a movement and an effort now to center the perspectives of those people and let them really guide formerly incarcerated people or people who are currently incarcerated. And it has me thinking about your topics of reparations. I do feel like it's an important part of all of this, and I see that there's kind of on the ground organizing models of that, of material means to support each other that are kind of manifesting in the world of criminal justice related things. Like a lot of organizing groups will start a mutual aid fund to be able to send money inside the prisons so that people incarcerated can have extra money for their commissary funds. there's a lot going on in terms of like trying to get Black radical writers into prisons through book clubs and through like different forms of political education in that way. So I was just wondering if like if anyone else is thinking about, you know, what models for this exist outside the university and what can we learn from those, like things that people are already on the ground doing. A decolonial project is definitely different than kind of what's going on in the criminal justice sphere, but I think there's similarities between the two. So I don't know. I don't quite have a question. It's just wondering if anyone can speak to that.
That's something I've been thinking about a bit as well, and just thinking about, you know, I think I was saying to some of the other fellow panelists that when thinking about what to say today, there's like a lot of sitting in discomfort, and this other panel that I was on about solving empire, like a lot of sitting with like who am I to sort of solve these problems, and that I don't have answers, and I often finish my remarks with more questions, and I think something we can take from abolitionists, and I think also from a lot of third world solidarity movements is the idea that experimentation is important, right? That it's a work in progress and that we're all participating in a larger conversation. And so I agree with you, right? That like, you know, like Mariam Kaba, whoever, right, is that we're trying it out, and that we don't have all the solutions yet. And I think that this forum is a demonstration of that. So that's one place I think I take inspiration from. And I think recently I revisited Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams, and that's like another place to think about how the movements and thinkers and scholar activists and the kinds of projects that they had were incomplete and often, you know, in some ways problematic, but we can look to see what visions did they have for the future, for liberation, and they're partial, and I think that that's okay. So that's sort of where I sit with it now, which maybe is my own personal cop-out, but yeah. So it's just, yeah, I'm happy you brought that up because I've been thinking about that a lot.
I'm gonna just follow on what Katrina just said, and also I'm gonna contradict you as usual.
You have a Jew debate again. A blast from the past.
So just speaking for myself personally, for me this is not just a project of decolonizing sociology. So for me this is a question of thinking about a continuation of the decolonization movement, and that's why I love learning from people like Paget, because you know there is something that happened with decolonization that clearly didn't bring the political projects or solutions that people were hoping for, and so there's an entire generation of thinkers and revolutionaries and activists who have thought about these questions, and I do think that I see myself kind of learning from these people, standing on their shoulders and trying to think about alternative futures. And obviously, the role of the intellectual to me is central to that project, and it's central because colonization, the project of colonization kind of became a problem of the colonies, right? It became a question of developments or quote-unquote failed states without thinking about that relationality, whereas the question of migration in Europe became entirely delinked from Europe's colonial history, again delinking that relationality. So the work of the intellectual for me is political work and trying to tell us how to think about the making of the modern world differently in order to then build political projects based on that. And does that mean that my role as an intellectual, as a scholar in an elite context is compromised and complicated? Yes, totally. It's a whole set of thorny questions that arise from that, and that's why we sit kind of uncomfortably thinking about these things. But I do see myself, I see this as a political project first and foremost, rather than, and one that is making a truth claim, right? That is empirically better, but it's not just about sociology.
Okay, coming right after Riki, who made this bigger and ended with not just about sociology, I'm asking a very limited disciplinary question. To use a phrase that Katrina just used about sitting in discomfort. in the last panel, I was sitting with discomfort with how the conversation turned, because it became, there was a panel of people who were all not American, and there was this move towards provincializing America correctly and saying, are we decolonizing sociology or decolonizing American sociology? So I absolutely applaud that move. But then something happens then that American sociology then subsumes knowledge from other people. So in fact, what does it mean that there are many non-Americans within American institutions generating good knowledge that is then classified as American sociology? And that itself somewhat feels colonial to me. And I mean, my priors is I'm Kenyan, and I'm sort of sitting there being like, okay, I had an American education, and again, acknowledging Fanon, absolutely, I come from a certain class position in Kenya, but I do think I'm not quite comfortable with where we left that conversation with what American sociology is, in a room that is filled with people who are themselves not American, and those who are American, I would like to say, have a contentious orientation to what it means to be American. So, not a question really, just a declaration of discomfort, and wondering what other people might have to say about that.
This isn't an answer, but just, just some observations about certainly conversations about brain drain and cultural and knowledge appropriation, and even, organic intellectuals versus, I was certainly, Gramsci would say that once you've been raised in an intellectual, U.S. institution and then intellectually raised, you're no longer an organic intellectual, right? And so I think that, and again, that's not an answer, but just bringing up the kind of more complicated nuance to you can be non-American, but if you have only been educated in U.S. institutions, and there's still kind of this question about the center, right? And the center is taking, but it's not actually contributing to Kenyan knowledge. There are certain scholars that might be known as, this is like Mahmoud Mandani is Ugandan, and therefore, things like that. But that's not contributing to the Ugandan project. He actually, he does contribute. So that was maybe a poor example. But so often it's not actually a translation back, right? And so I do think that there is more nuance to the fact that you can be of somewhere else, but if your entire career and where your basis is, that does add a dynamic that is not just about like a binary of like being from or not being not from.
So I love what Samuel is raising here, and it feels from this really privileged position to be admirable to sit in discomfort. But I would rather think, in terms of collective action around these issues people are raising. And it seems like there's so much weight put on the individual intellectual in this conversation that it is an unbearable weight. And I wonder, given that this is such a powerful assembly of individuals, but we're more than individuals, we're tied to each other in all these ways across decades of association and sometimes just moments of meeting. And if we were to think, for example, and I'm trying to build on the last point, if we were to think about the kinds of actions that we can take to produce the outcomes that we would wish to see, and this is not only providing lists of references that will then review our publications for publication, but rather think about what are the institutional changes we would like to see, and how do we mobilize associations in that spirit. Here's an example of something that's really within grasp, but rarely done in universities, and that is to rethink what the basis is for recognition, for hiring, for promotion, for tenure, for prizes. And there's a guy that was at University of Michigan who is one of my inspirations. His name is Scott Kuroshiga. And he was part of the Grace Lee Boggs Center in Detroit. And he was trying to say that all of our publications are great, but they're even better when they're in line with the social movement that's actually trying to achieve some sort of transformational practice. And so he still has all of these grand analysis. He just has a book out from Princeton, so he has that game. But he also has a game about this. How could we change University of Michigan's evaluative practice so that we actually had engaged scholarship as something that was meaningful more than just getting a little fellowship from Swearer? And he made, and I'm saying that with appreciation.
Hey, we have great fellowship.
But notice, it's an additive. It's not foundational to who we are supposed to be and how we can be evaluated as meaningful scholars. So the public sociology, with all deference to Michael, can be written about ad nauseum. But to actually find the public sociology that bears public consequence, that is then recognized by the university, by the global networks, as itself valuable and transformative, is one of the things that we can be doing as a collective that winds up enabling those of us less senior to be able to undertake that practice maybe sooner than when they get to be my age.
Costa, and then
So, I don't want to take a lot of time, but I do have to say this is awesome. Like, this is really great. I haven't had anything like this or felt this dumb in a while. There are like two big tensions that jump out at me from some of the conversations and the panels that we've had. And one of them, and I'll throw myself under the bus because it's easier, but I think y'all will feel where I'm coming from, is this tension between reforming and revolutionizing, and reformers and revolutionaries.
that's an old tension.
It's a very old one. But I think we have people who express positions from both sides. And, I would say, when I was 17, I would have found it insulting to be called a reformer. I wanted to be a revolutionary. I'm in my 30s now. And I know that by engaging this deep with the system, by being this socialized and indoctrinated by the system, the best that I can do is to be a reformer. And if we take Audre Lorde's Master's Tool stuff a little far, I would say most of us, by being in this space, are de facto reformers at best. And, I put myself first, come with me under this bus. What are the limits? What are the limits by being in this space to what we're doing, and how can we be as honest about that as possible? Which leads me to the second piece, that I feel like in our discipline especially, we're constantly looking for the theory of everything. And I've heard Padgett make this case for where is the next big theory? And I feel like it's very difficult to find any one thing, person, or framework or lens that's going to help us understand everything. And we've been adding people as if we interlaid enough layers, we were going to get it all. And we're kind of being arbiters over what's the next thing that we need in order to understand everything, where I feel like it could be okay to say no one lens, no one theory, regardless of how brilliant, is going to help us understand everything about the social world, and we can also be okay with that. And that came from a conversation I had with you recently, where you said something to the effect of, under what conditions do we X, Y, Z? And how important those conditions are, because we're still talking about how great something that a man in the 18th and 19th century, came up with, and it helps explain some of what we see, but certainly not all. And that's why we're trying to add more and more stuff. And can we be okay with that?
Okay, Nicole raised her hand before, and Michael, and then you, and then John.
Avasta, that was brilliant, by the way. So self-deprecating, but I mean. But so I want to build on these points, and then maybe talk to Michael about this. I mean, like when I was an assistant professor, a former president of ASA pulled me aside and said, if you continue doing public work, your colleagues won't respect you. And I said, well, with due respect, a child died in Chicago, and I know something about the circumstances around which created that death and violence for that boy and for many other black boys, so I'm not gonna be silent. I don't care about it. I really don't. I mean, I didn't say I don't fucking care, but I should have said I don't fucking care. And that led me to think about this idea of sociological malpractice. Like, what is it to be a sociologist and to defer responsibility to somebody else if you know something about the power relationships, the sociological factors that led to death and destruction and other types of things that are so imperative. But at the same time that that was happening, the university was making me into a coffee table book to sell images of diversity for the university, while the department on the local level was saying this is not sociology, this is not meritorious, this is not. So, I mean, I agree 100% with what Michael's saying, but isn't that so capitalist? To take advocacy work meant to lend, just to put the lens, I call it name and shame, to name and shame white violence, and then to use it to put a brown face on their coffee table book and call me a world changer while they try to say that what you're doing is not sociological, is not meritorious, is not any of the things that what Michael's saying. So I'm just saying it to, like, you know, these structures, as Prab reminds us, are so violent, there's no like quick fix. Like, we could change the metrics, but there's always gonna be this capitalist underlay that can take and reappropriate, and that's the hard part. I don't know what the next step is. I do like naming and shaming sociology and saying there is something like malpractice. There should be. And when our colleagues do nothing, they should be called out for doing nothing, or when they shame a young scholar that has important work that in some ways does what the best of Du Bois did, which was show white violence or white unpunished crime, like Ida B. Wells, that is sociology, and that we continue to reinforce that definition. I don't know if that's colonial to say I'm centering that, but I feel like we have to. We have to center that. So, I don't know. 2 cents, personal experience, very Du Boisian.
Yeah, very Du Boisian. Talking about Du Bois, if I may comment on what you were saying before, I mean, I think it's really problematic if we don't feel uncomfortable. We should feel uncomfortable. And that's the character of doing sociology. And it could be social science. That we are, and that's a Du Boisian point, we are simultaneously studying the world of which we are a part. We try to deny that we are a part of that world, but we are in that world. And I think that's a very uncomfortable position. So if we are not feeling uncomfortable, there is something very wrong. And so I sort of privilege discomfort. When I teach ethnography courses, I say to students, if you're not suffering, you're not doing field work. There is this public sociology issue. You know, when I give talks, and I have given talks all over the world on public sociology, in many places, particularly in the global south, a place like South Africa or a place like Brazil, they look at me as though I'm crazy. Why on earth would you be a sociologist if you're not going to be a public sociologist? And they take it as a matter of course that they engage with the world that they are studying, and at great cost. South Africa, I know the situation better than Brazil or Latin America, but I know 2 significant sociologists, who happen to be white, who actually were assassinated by the apartheid regime for relatively innocuous participation in a critical sociology. So, you know, the rest of the world, well, not the rest of the world, the global south, and you can, I'm sure many of you here have similar stories, that's sociology, that's what it's about. So what you're saying, Nicole, is just precisely what people think about. Now, we're in this weird country. This is the strangest. I mean, talk about universalizing the United States, which is an absurd practice, because this is the weirdest country in the world. We have this incredibly professional sociology, which is where we have to begin, which is what Michael was talking about. That we are indeed facing, I mean, it's, when I tell people in the rest of the world, you know, public sociology, everybody's against it, you know. Well, how can you be against public sociology? And so, yeah, so I think that we are so professionalized, for whatever reason. We can call it capitalism, we can call it rationalization, or we can call it Durkheimian abnormal division of labor. Whatever it is, that's the reality from which we begin, and we have to recognize that. And I thought that Michael was going to move in a direction which I think is a very important direction, is that we think not as individuals but collectively. In my view, this has been the most extraordinary event that I've experienced for the last decade. To hear us discussing what on earth we should be doing as sociologists, and to have had these amazing papers, I felt like I was being mowed down by a sort of double-decker bus. But anyway, but fine. I mean, that's one of the great things about sociology. Parsons thought it was all convergent. No, sociology is a rowdy discipline. It's full of anarchy, conflict, and that's what's so great about it, that we can indeed have a dialogue that we've had today. So I think what I would suggest is that, in the old days, when I was a young Marxist, we had a strategy. A strategy was, we'll engage with professional sociology with one foot, and with the other foot, we will be writing, engaging, sometimes publicly engaging, but also building up a community around more radical, i.e. Marxist journals. And what I think, listening to you here, old man that I am, I think that this is a similar moment. That, yeah, we have to deal with the fact that many of us in this room are sociologists, and aspiring to having tenure-track jobs. And it's not a terrible thing. We can do things with it. Academia is relatively free. People are not telling us what to teach, not yet. So there is a room for maneuver within the so-called professional sociology. But on the other hand, we can sustain, or you can sustain, a culture of critique. A black radical tradition can be sustained even at the same time as we can have our transformed canon. I was thinking, by the way, about reforms. There was a thing, Gortz and Andre Gortz in the 1970s. Nobody's ever heard of Gortz here. But anyway, Gortz talks about non-reformist reforms. That's Du Bois. You shove Du Bois into sociology, you don't know what's going to happen next. It could be really explosive. But anyway, my point is that I would think it would be, it's of the moment. It's of the moment that you here, the people who have been participating, the people interested in this conversation, set up their own digital journal or whatever to actually continue the conversation that's been going on here, that Jose and his colleagues and graduate students and undergraduate students here have sustained. This is the epicenter as I began today. I think having it's no good just stopping now. You can't just end this conversation. I really think that this is a great moment to build a conversation that will go beyond Brown, go beyond the East Coast, make it all the way to the West Coast, and perhaps go beyond that, and to engage with all the countries we've been talking about, which are very diverse. So that's my little speech.
I just want to add a little comment. Non-reformist reforms via Guts, and actually Patrick Bond is now back in the activism circle, so.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation was great, and I'm really glad that this is an open conversation. I just want to track, it seems like institutions going to sustain individuals or places, because like my man said, or it's like, hey, I'm from this place and I bring a certain politic. Maybe I want to disagree with that because, being very personal, I did 1.5 years in prison, right? And I got locked up when I was 12 the first time, so I had over 19 arrests before 17, all from just stealing Kool-Aid at Walmart, right? So, pretty much. I couldn't leave the States, so to tell me that I'm a puppet of United States, ideals, is another kind of international move to tell me that, because the thing is, when I can't vote, right? They told me that, a liberal told me, because you've been locked up so much, you're under the god of the warden, right? Your mind has been warped in a way where it's a legitimate thing. You're not free enough, right? It's kind of that same strand of you've been institutionalized in a way where you're not even your own. Well, if you go look up some of it in 2012, I started a prison riot. We started a prison riot. We weren't getting paid our due wages. We had a sit out, right? It was only $2.25, but we got it, right? I get out, I write that, I get into Harvard, Brown, these places, right? I don't think that Brown, I disagree. I don't think that me coming here turns me into a reformist, right? I don't think that, you know, certain places bring these automatic things to it, right? Going back to what I originally said, I'm bringing a certain politic here. I got told that I'm a walking contradiction of Brown. Therefore, we just don't like you. The cop, I've been arrested twice here. I've been kicked out here. I mean, this place, it becomes a thing where even Africana or these politics, it becomes like you don't have a certain Caribbean politics, so you don't really know how to be radical enough. You're doing this kind of institutional stuff. I'm like, wait, where's the thing? And it's like, okay, that's why I firmly kind of maybe, I don't know if I disagree with how institutions stay in the individual in sociology. I just think it's not as complex as American black life can be. Because I could leave the States at 12, and that's part of the apparatus, so I can't go to Kenya, right? So.
You know, just to follow off that, but then to go to some earlier points, I mean, certainly, and Du Bois was very much part of this, you know, there are conversations I've had in my school about hiring somebody who does Black studies as an Americanist in an a school of international service, and that you're dealing with internal colonization. That is as global as it gets, and Black internationalism was always, you know, a connection across. And so, you know, the idea about decolonization and the idea about empire, I mean, you can't take away Black studies from those issues, and the history of that has always been implicated, right? It's always been a unitary history. So I do think that it can be an instrument of power and an instrument of treating, you know, problems as somewhere else versus problems as here, is actually pretending as if these are two separate things. And certainly, you know, the politics of for example, you know, like anti-communism and all of these projects that actually divorced the ideas of race in studying the United States, that is part of our history in creating a bifurcation of international struggles and you know, U.S. struggles. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind. And then as far as, you know, thinking about institutions, I'm actually gonna borrow from Karita at ASA when there were students who were asking questions about how do I change this? And she said something really important. She said, and something that I think is really important to remember, the university is a white supremacist institution, right? We're not gonna get around that. And if we're trying to you know, do the fully revolutionary thing and blow it up, we're gonna blow ourselves up. We're gonna be the ones under the bus, right? This is a white supremacist institution. So we do our best without exhausting ourselves, right? And we recognize that we are working, as Michael and others have said, in the hegemonic structures that we're critiquing, right? And so if I choose not to you know, if I end up not at an elite institution, I end up with a course load that doesn't allow me to do the kinds of publications I want to. If I'm deciding that I'm gonna opt out because I wanna be a revolutionary, I'm not going to have the research budget to do the research I want to do. I'm literally not going to have the time. We are all so tired, you know, and heaven forbid you have a family, you know, and so there are some pragmatics of, you know, and I think, and, you know, maybe I'm an outlier here. I think it's great to do public sociology. I think it's so important, but I think it's actually unfair to ask everybody to be involved in the community, because the role of the intellectual is important, and some of us are just tired, you know, and I think that it is a struggle of the collective, and I think it is a struggle about recognizing the people who do the public work, but it's also about recognizing the people who do high theory, and it's about recognizing these many ways of changing, but to have to expect one person to do everything is a little bit unfair, you know, and certainly, like, you know, if I take hegemony seriously, I want to publish in a top journal. If I take it seriously, I want to get a Princeton press contract or whatever, because I recognize that that's about legitimacy and visibility. And if I opt out of that, I recognize what the consequences are. you know, and so I just think it can be really unrealistic to say that the people who are fighting the struggle have to, you know, do things that are actually, we know, not effective in this white supremacist, capitalist world order, right? Because we're also subject to that criteria.
Okay, Said and Nabil, and then we'll conclude. I'll say something to conclude because we are running out of time, but yeah.
Yeah, I want to build on Jordana's point, because when we talk about writing publicly, we should also acknowledge the hierarchy which is within this group. There are some of us who are in a more precarious position than others. So I would say that the responsibility of publicly engaging with decolonial sociology probably lies more on them. The reality is that the job market and the academia is not what it used to be 30, 40 years ago. The pressures on young scholars right now are just immense. We are literally tiring ourselves, and it's just on the limit, so yeah.
Nabila?
Yeah, I really appreciate Professor Matron saying that we're just tired. And I want to connect that to what Michael has said, and also what Professor Orr has said before. It's like, you know, there is a way to be not tired if we actually had a kind of ethic of care. If we, you know, like, because being a public sociologist isn't, maybe it shouldn't be about marketing yourself as a public sociologist, but you have a community of care. When you cannot comment on this publicly, somebody else steps in. And, you know, and this also ties into the question about, you know, activism, where people do create communities of care, because what else is mutual aid if not that? And I personally am really wary of going into an activist space and then being the face of it as academics. It's not our place, honestly. I think we can, you know, but what we can do is take, if we take it seriously, what these activist groups are doing, networks are doing, which is like creating a community of care, practicing an ethics of care, not always, as anybody who's been in activism spaces will know. And we can actually translate that and say, yes, academia is riven in the way that it is unequal in the way that it is, but look at this other kind of social group under the same conditions of racial and colonial capitalism, with concrete real stakes, who are able to sustain a different kind of sociality. And are we able to learn that from other places?
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, for, you know, the speakers for participating, and the people who spoke in this session for bringing their insights. And, you know, to me it leaves, I mean, with two ideas. I mean, one, the importance of dialogue. I mean, you know, we have different positions, but it is only through conversation that we can come and see, you know, what are the different issues and what may be shared goals and you know, activities. Second, I think that what Nabila just said is very important. It's really, you know, I think it's key, because, you know, we all are academics and we like to do well. I mean, it's what we do, and we like to do well at what we do. I mean, and there is no wrong in that. We have to make a living, we work, we do this, and we think it matters. But I mean, there is also, I mean, on the one side, Michael was saying having one foot here, one foot there, and Nabila was saying creating communities of care. I mean, it has to go beyond the individual somehow, and it has to be about creating solidarity and creating other forms of support. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with being successful individually, but there is also the need to think about how we build solidarity, which is what Michael was saying, and how we come together to forge a common project. And as Acosta was saying, and I have this quote in my mind that I've been looking for a lot. It's a quote that I think is from Mariátegui, but I've been reading Mariátegui a lot, and I can't find the quote, so maybe I just imagine it, and it's not from Mariátegui. But in my mind, it's from Mariátegui, and the quote about reform of revolution goes like, society will change very slowly on the condition that we struggle very mightily. It's like, the question of reform of revolution, the question is what do we want to do and what are we willing to do? And I think that, this is a step. This is something that we did, and, we may come up with ideas, and talking with Michael earlier, he was talking about creating some kind of journal, but or creating something online where people can bring all these positions. So there are many ideas, and I think it's important. It's energizing. It takes us it takes us in the direction of creating a community of care with a meaning towards making academy, and not only academy, is something better. And I would like to live. I mean, it leaves me with that. I hope that you live with that same feeling, and I hope that we can continue these conversations and continue moving a project of changing what we do, changing our professional sphere, and and there are many, as Saida left, but there are many ways, and as a journalist, there are many ways of being, activists, and doing theory. Ideas matter, and being a theorist matter. I mean, this is something that I remember Louis Gordon always emphasizing. The world of ideas matter, and being engaged in the world of ideas and producing critical ideas matter. So that's also a way of being activist. So everyone is different, and everyone has their own way of engaging, but I think that the important thing is keeping this dialogue and keeping this idea of creating something collectively that is different from what we have. And maybe if we struggle mightily each in their own way, things will change very slowly, but will change. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you all for participating.